A brand new Marvel movie, Morbius, is now released in theaters. It's a movie that has vampires, some jump scares, and a couple of action scenes. And when you hear all those words combined together, you would think to yourself that this should be counted as a scary movie. The question that should be implied, though, is how scary is this movie, Morbius? Well, I created a system to figure out how scary the movie can actually be, or what can actually count as a scary movie. And this video will be breaking down all of those segments and figuring out how scary the movie is, and whether or not it could be scary enough for you. So the first bracket that we're going to be analyzing is how much suffering is endured throughout the entirety of this film. And the way that this bracket works is done by these 4 examples. How much gore is in the film? Is there any bloods or guts? Is there anything that disgusting that's in the film? How much torture is in the film? Is anybody being suffered through torture? Is there anything that much pain enduring that would make the character suffer? How much dread does the movie have through the atmosphere or through the narrative? And lastly, how brutal does the movie get? So after watching the film and figuring out how much suffering there is in here, there really isn't much. As for gore, it's almost non-existent. There's like a couple of scenes where there might have been some blood here and there, so I guess it could count for like a 1 out of 5. As for torture, if you're talking about inflicting pain on the main character, Morbius, there are some times where it does suck for him, whether it's in the real world and he's lost people, or if it means him dying physically. I would give it like a 2.5 out of 5 because if the scenes would have worked where he lost people, the torture scenes would have worked to a 3 out of 5, but the execution was not done that great, so it's lost some points. In terms of dread or brutality, it's basically non-existent because in order to capture that essence, you really need to inflict that type of pain for the movie, and the film doesn't really treat it that maturely. Since it's a part of like the Marvel franchise, it has the tendency of telling jokes and being funny and act like somewhat of a lazy action film rather than having the tendency to feel somewhat uncomfortable or scary. So I give both of those a 0 out of 5. So all of this calculated up is going to add up to a 3.5 out of 20. Very confusing number, but that's the way the math works. Second bracket we'll go into detail is, are there any particular demons in the film? And there are 3 examples that will discuss what this topic means. Is there any scary creatures in here? Vampires, dragons, so there's the obvious answer right there. But again, we're going to discuss how scary these creatures are. Second, is there any psychological evil inside of our characters? Any inner demons? Does the movie give us a psychological analysis on those characters? And finally, is the film revolve around some spiritual evil or entity that's surrounded in the atmosphere? It could be like its own entity, its own character. So for the demons, let's start off with scary creatures. Yeah, there are a few vampires in here, but they don't really look that scary. A couple of times when you see their facial expressions, they're pretty much goofy. And for how they are treated as vampires, they're not really shown to their full potential of what their characters are. For the design, it can count for like a 2 out of 5, just to be fair, since vampires are a part of being a scary creature, and how scary they are, it loses 3 points, so that's why it's a 2 out of 5. For the psychological evil segment, there is one character that does have that personality trait in the film, and Matt Smith's character is the one that does that. In a way, it feels goofy and pretty silly, and at the exact same time, it's also generic, so it's nothing that intimidating. But for the story itself, it's done exactly the way that you think it's going to be. The problem, though, is that it's nothing sinister and nothing that uncomfortable to look at through the lens of Matt Smith. And Matt Smith, if you looked at his movie Last Night in Soho, he could be a very intimidating character. So the way that I saw him in this one, it's more so him just goofing around and having fun with the character. For the reason being, I'm gonna go ahead and give this a 2.5 out of 5 since Matt Smith is having fun with it, and it does actually have that evil spirit inside of him, but again, it could have been way more intimidating than the way that the film was. And lastly, is there any evil spirits that's inside the atmosphere that we're fully unaware of? The only thing that's close to that is when you see the perspective of Morbius and transforming into a vampire, there are these terrible CGI effects where he could be able to that look spiritual and look metaphysical, but at the exact same time, there's nothing outside of the ordinary that would indicate it's an outside entity. It's just some type of power that he's capable of having. I don't really count that as a spiritual entity outside of us. So for at least trying, even though it's not necessarily doing that, I would give it a 0.5 out of 5. And when calculating all of these numbers up, we round ourselves up with 1 out of 3 for this segment. And the final bracket is, does the plot revolve around something scary? And the 3 examples for this detail is, are there any suspenseful situations in here? Anything intense that would get us on the edge of our seats, that would make the characters feel insanely uncomfortable? Do we see characters who their personality is to kill and have no motivation or ambition to stop whatsoever? And lastly, are the protagonist characters in situations where they're in traps and they can't figure out how to escape? Does this movie carry out any scenes whatsoever related to those topics? Now, can the plot revolve around something scary? Is there any suspenseful situations? Well, that depends on what you mean by suspenseful, because there's definitely action scenes, and if you do have action scenes, they can be intense and they can lead towards suspenseful situations. But the problem there is that these action scenes don't really amount to anything. There's no general worry or cause for you to ask yourself, how are these characters going to get out of this mess, or what's going to happen to them in the near future, because they don't go into detail describing reasons why you should feel bad for these people and how to feel uncomfortable with them during these situations. Sometimes it doesn't really feel like suspense because they can easily get out of situations because they're scientists, or there's like one entity against another great entity, and the plot can go in a predictable way where you can automatically know what's going to happen in the next scene. So for suspenseful situations, it's really lacking. I would give it a 1 out of 5 because it looks like it's trying to do something. It's just not good within its execution. Well, do we see any characters whose personality is to kill and have no motivation to stop? Well, yeah, there is a character that does do that, but here's the thing. But instead of the development adding in weight, and why a character like this could be beyond terrifying and very threatening, the plot for this character just seems like a device just to have a random reason for this character to do something. There's no potential dedication to it, there's nothing psychological or in-depth about it, it's just there. So, like the suspenseful situations, for the sake of actually doing it but not really executing it correctly, I'll give this one also a 1 out of 5. And finally, are the main protagonist characters in traps where they don't have really much room to escape? No. There isn't any scene in the movie where it looks like they are uncomfortable or they're in situations where they would have to make choices that they don't want to make. Morbius can literally get away with anything that he wants because since the movie would like to treat him as if he's a vampire, he can actually do whatever he wants, even though there are weaknesses to what vampires can do. So, no, but the film doesn't really want to pay attention to that type of detail, so I have to give that section a 0 out of 5. And the final calculations for all of these 3 lead up to being 2 out of 15. And with that being said, adding up all of the calculations that are regarded within 3 of these brackets, how scary is Morbius? It is 17% scary, which means it is barely scary at all, which means no, it's not really that scary. And there you go, guys. This is what I've deduced to figure out whether or not Morbius is pretty much a scary movie, or if it does technically count as a scary movie, how scary can it actually be? What do you guys think about this movie? Do you think it is actually scary, or do you think it's not scary whatsoever? Put your thoughts down in the comment section below, and let's have a conversation about it. And like this video if you agree with what I say, or dislike this video if you disagree with what I say. I don't mind the dislikes. So that is it I have for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll be sure to see you in the next video.